In the quiet town of Meadow Grove, a tense courtroom drama unfolded, captivating the community and media alike. The early morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. The room, grand in design, felt suffocating, filled with spectators, journalists, and a few faces lined with quiet tension. Among them sat Victoria Hartley, her calm exterior betraying none of the turmoil beneath the surface. Her dark brown skin glowed faintly under the artificial light, and her neatly braided hair rested on her shoulders. Victoria sat upright, her back straight, hands clasped lightly in front of her. She was dressed modestly in a crisp white blouse and black slacks, a deliberate choice to exude humility and respect. Yet her sharp eyes scanned the room with precision, taking in every face, every movement. To the casual observer, she looked like any other defendant, but those paying close attention could sense something unusual about her, a quiet intensity that seemed out of place for someone accused of a violent crime. The bailiff called the court to order, and all eyes turned to the front of the room, where Judge Elizabeth Thompson, an older white woman with thinning silver hair, entered. She carried an air of authority, though her face betrayed a weariness that came from years of presiding over cases she'd rather forget. This one, however, seemed to ignite a spark of interest in her, perhaps due to the presence of Officer Daniel Miller sitting smugly at the plaintiff's table, or the murmurings of a case that had already captured the attention of local news outlets. "State versus Victoria Hartley," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. Victoria rose, her movements deliberate and controlled, and faced the judge. The whispers in the room grew louder as people craned their necks for a better view. Officer Miller leaned back in his chair, his expression one of confidence, almost amusement. Dressed sharply in his police uniform, the officer exuded the kind of arrogance that comes from years of unquestioned authority. Victoria's lawyer, Marcus Davis, a young black attorney fresh out of law school, shuffled nervously through his notes. He glanced at Victoria, hoping to find reassurance in her face, but she didn't return the look. Her eyes remained fixed on the judge, her expression unreadable. Davis took a deep breath and stood. "Your Honor, we are prepared to proceed," he said, his voice wavering slightly. Judge Thompson nodded, her gaze shifting to Miller. "Officer Miller, you may take the stand." The officer rose, every movement exaggerated, as if he were performing for an unseen audience. He adjusted his uniform before making his way to the witness stand, pausing briefly to glance at Victoria. His smirk was faint but unmistakable, a predator sure of his prey. As he took the oath, Victoria studied him, observing the way his fingers fidgeted slightly, the subtle shift in his posture as he sat down. These were details most would overlook, but Victoria catalogued them with the precision of someone trained to read body language. She didn't flinch, didn't move, as Miller began to speak. "On the evening in question," Miller began, his voice steady and loud enough to carry across the room, "I was responding to a disturbance call near the east side of town. I encountered the defendant, Miss Hartley, loitering outside a closed business. There were murmurs in the courtroom. Loitering was often used as a catch-all accusation, especially against people of color." Miller pressed on, seemingly unfazed. "When I approached her and asked what she was doing there, she immediately became hostile. She refused to identify herself, raised her voice, and when I attempted to de-escalate the situation, she physically assaulted me." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Victoria remained still, her face a mask of calm. Miller shifted in his seat, feigning a pained expression. "She hit me in the chest and attempted to reach for my service weapon. At that point, I had no choice but to restrain her." From the back of the room, a woman's voice muttered, "Sounds like a lie." The judge quickly called for order. "Thank you, Officer Miller," Judge Thompson said, her voice neutral. "You may step down." Victoria's lawyer rose, visibly nervous. "Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to ask the court to consider—" "Save it for your cross-examination, Mr. Davis," the judge interrupted. "Let's move on." As the prosecution rested its case, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. Miller returned to his seat, his smirk now a full grin. He exchanged a glance with his fellow officers seated in the back row. Victoria didn't miss the wink he gave them. "Miss Hartley," the judge said, her tone carrying an edge of skepticism, "it's your turn to testify." Victoria stood, smoothing her blouse as she approached the stand. The room fell silent as she took her seat, the weight of 100 stares pressing down on her. She adjusted the microphone in front of her, her movements slow and deliberate. "Miss Hartley," the prosecutor began, a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and sharper tongue, "can you explain your actions on the night in question?" Victoria leaned forward slightly, her voice steady and measured. "I can, but first I need to clarify one thing. The officer's account is not only inaccurate, but intentionally misleading." There was a collective intake of breath. The prosecutor smirked. "Bold accusation, Miss Hartley. Do you have any proof to back it up?" Victoria met his gaze, her dark eyes unyielding. "I believe the truth will come to light soon enough." The prosecutor opened his mouth to retort, but was momentarily speechless. Judge Thompson cleared her throat, signaling for the questioning to continue. As Victoria began to recount her version of events, the tension in the room became palpable. The audience hung on her every word, sensing that this was no ordinary defendant. Unbeknownst to everyone, the wheels of justice were already turning, and the carefully constructed lies of Officer Miller were beginning to unravel. Victoria sat on the stand, her posture as unwavering as her composure. She took a moment before speaking, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the wooden railing. The courtroom silence was suffocating, every breath held in anticipation of what she might say. "On the night in question," she began, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom, "I was on my way home from visiting a friend. I stopped near the corner of Magnolia and Fifth to check my phone for directions." She paused briefly, allowing the detail to sink in. "That's when Officer Miller approached me." The prosecutor leaned forward, ready to pounce. "And you're saying this encounter was completely unprovoked?" Victoria tilted her head slightly, her expression unwavering. "Not entirely. I was standing on the sidewalk, which, as far as I know, isn't illegal. He approached me with his flashlight pointed directly at my face and asked in a tone I wouldn't call friendly what I was doing there and how I responded. I told him I was checking directions," Victoria replied evenly. "He asked for my identification. I asked if I'd done anything wrong." The prosecutor seized the moment. "So you questioned his authority?" "I questioned his motive," Victoria corrected, her voice firm but not aggressive. "I wasn't obstructing traffic, trespassing, or causing any disturbance. I wanted to know why he was asking for my ID." There was a ripple of murmurs in the courtroom. Judge Thompson banged her gavel lightly. "Order in the court," Victoria continued, her tone unchanging. "When I asked for clarification, he raised his voice and accused me of being uncooperative. I told him I wasn't trying to cause any trouble, but before I could say anything else, he grabbed my arm." Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, clearly trying to decide how to twist her testimony to his advantage. "Are you claiming the officer physically restrained you without cause?" Victoria nodded. "Yes, and when I told him to let go, he tightened his grip. He said, and I quote, 'Women like you need to learn how to listen.'" Gasps erupted from the gallery. This time the judge's gavel came down harder. "Order! I will not tolerate interruptions." The prosecutor forced a smile. "Miss Hartley, that's a serious allegation. Do you have any proof of this statement?" Victoria looked directly at him, her gaze unflinching. "No, because the body camera he was wearing conveniently malfunctioned. Isn't that right, Officer Miller?" All eyes turned to Miller, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His confident smirk faded, replaced by a slight clenching of his jaw. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Let's focus on the facts, Miss Hartley. You claim the officer restrained you? What happened next?" Victoria folded her hands in her lap, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I told him I didn't consent to being touched and asked him to let me go. He didn't. Instead, he accused me of resisting arrest even though I hadn't moved. When I tried to pull my arm away, he slammed me against the patrol car." Her words were a punch to the gut for everyone listening. A few people in the audience whispered to one another, their faces a mixture of disbelief and anger. The tension in the room was thick, and even the judge seemed momentarily taken aback. "And after that?" the prosecutor pressed, his tone more subdued now. Victoria's gaze didn't waver. "He handcuffed me and told me I was under arrest for assaulting an officer." The prosecutor leaned back, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Miss Hartley, you're a strong woman. Is it possible the officer felt threatened by your physical resistance?" Victoria didn't flinch. "I'm not stronger than a trained police officer, and let's be clear, I didn't resist until he violated my rights." The prosecutor opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Victoria added, "I also didn't reach for his weapon despite his claims. That was a fabrication to justify his use of force." The room seemed to freeze. Miller shifted again, visibly uneasy. The prosecutor's face darkened as he struggled to maintain his composure. "Miss Hartley, you're asking this court to believe that Officer Miller, a decorated member of the force, fabricated an entire incident. Do you have anything to back up your version of events?" Victoria smiled faintly, a subtle but powerful shift in her demeanor. "The truth always has a way of revealing itself, Counselor. You'll see soon enough." The judge leaned forward. "Miss Hartley, are you implying there is evidence the court has not yet seen?" Victoria's lawyer, Marcus Davis, stood quickly. "Your Honor, we intend to submit additional evidence during the proceedings." The prosecutor scoffed. "More stalling tactics, Your Honor. If the defense had anything substantial, they would have presented it already." Victoria turned to face the judge. "Your Honor, the truth takes time, but I promise you this. When it comes out, it will be undeniable." The judge studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "Very well, we'll reset for today. Court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. As the gavel came down, the courtroom erupted into whispers. Victoria rose from the stand, her movements calm and deliberate. She walked past Officer Miller, who avoided her gaze, and joined her lawyer at the defense table. "Are you sure about this, Davis?" Marcus whispered, his voice filled with doubt. Victoria placed a hand on his arm, her grip steady and reassuring. "Trust me, Marcus. Tomorrow the truth will speak louder than anything Miller could ever say." As she walked out of the courtroom, the murmurs of the crowd followed her, a mix of curiosity and speculation. Outside, the sun was setting, casting the town in a warm golden glow. Victoria paused on the courthouse steps, her eyes scanning the horizon. The fight was far from over, but she was ready. She had always been ready. The courthouse emptied slowly, the day's tension still clinging to the air like a heavy fog. Victoria stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, her silhouette framed against the orange hues of the setting sun. The hum of conversation and the shuffle of feet surrounded her, but she tuned it all out, her focus inward. She had faced tougher battles before, ones where survival wasn't guaranteed. But there was something uniquely suffocating about fighting in a courtroom where the truth could be buried under lies. Marcus Davis appeared at her side, his face a portrait of concern. "Turn!" The young lawyer clutched his briefcase tightly, as if it contained not just papers, but the weight of his responsibility to her. Victoria turned her head slightly, her gaze calm but unyielding. "What's on your mind, Marcus?" He exhaled deeply, his breath visible in the cool evening air. "You have to tell me what you're holding back. The judge knows it, the prosecutor knows it, and Miller, he's getting nervous. Whatever ace you're hiding, I need to know before we walk back into that courtroom tomorrow." Victoria's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "You'll know when the time is right." "That's not enough," he pressed, lowering his voice even further. "I'm your lawyer. If we're going to win this, I need to be prepared for whatever bombshell you're planning to drop." She studied him for a moment, the weight of her silence pressing down on him like a physical force. Finally, she nodded. "Meet me at my house tonight. I'll tell you everything." Marcus blinked, startled by the sudden shift. "You will?" "I will," she said firmly, "but not here." Victoria's modest home sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by tall oak trees that swayed gently in the night breeze. The faint glow of a porch light illuminated the walkway, casting long shadows across the gravel path. Marcus pulled up in his car, stepping out cautiously. The quiet of the area was almost unnerving after the chaos of the courtroom. He knocked lightly on the door, and Victoria answered almost immediately, as though she'd been standing there waiting. She wore a simple navy sweatshirt and black leggings, a stark contrast to the poised appearance she'd maintained earlier in the day. Her hair was tied back and her expression was unreadable. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. Marcus entered, his eyes scanning the space. The living room was neat and sparsely decorated, with only a few personal touches. A framed photograph of a younger Victoria in a Navy uniform, her arm around an older man in a similar uniform, a folded American flag displayed in a glass case on the mantel, and a bookshelf filled with titles on leadership, strategy, and history. "You live alone?" he asked, more out of curiosity than anything else. "For now," she replied, gesturing for him to sit on the couch. "Drink?" "No, I'm fine," he said, sitting down stiffly and setting his briefcase at his feet. "I'm here for answers." Victoria nodded, moving to the bookshelf. She pulled out a leather-bound folder, well-maintained, but worn at the edges. She placed it on the coffee table in front of him and sat across from him in a chair. Marcus eyed the folder but didn't reach for it. "What's this?" "My service record," she said simply. "Everything you need to know about me." He hesitated. "You're serious? You're just giving it to me?" She smirked faintly, appreciating his determination. "You're my lawyer. You need to know who you're defending." Marcus opened the folder carefully, his fingers brushing against the pages inside. There were neatly organized documents, discharge papers, commendations, training certifications. His eyes widened as he scanned the contents. "Wait," he muttered, flipping through the pages faster. "You were a Navy SEAL?" She finished for him. "Lieutenant Commander, retired." He stared at her, his mouth slightly open. "Victoria, this changes everything. Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because it's not just about who I was," she said, leaning forward. "It's about what Miller represents. This isn't just my fight, Marcus. It's about exposing the kind of corruption and bias that allows people like him to get away with this." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "The prosecutor's going to lose it when this comes out. And Miller, he'll crumble?" Victoria's expression darkened. "Miller won't crumble. Men like him double down when they're cornered. That's why we have to be smart, strategic." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of her words. "Do you think he knows?" "Not yet," she said. "But he's suspicious. You saw how he looked at me today. He knows there's something he doesn't know, and it's eating at him." Marcus closed the folder and leaned back, letting out a long breath. "So what's the plan?" Victoria's eyes glinted with a quiet determination. "Tomorrow we show the court the truth. But we don't just expose Miller for lying. We expose the system that enables him." "And how do we do that?" he asked, leaning forward. Victoria stood, her presence commanding even in her casual attire. She walked to the mantel, picking up the folded flag. She turned it over in her hands before looking back at him. "We make them see me, not as a defendant, but as the woman who spent 20 years protecting the very freedoms that man tried to strip from me." Her voice was steady but carried an edge, a quiet storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, not from fear, but from the sheer force of her resolve. "Victoria," he said softly, "tomorrow's going to be a fight." She placed the flag back on the mantel, her hand lingering on it for a moment. Then she turned to him, her eyes fierce. "I've been fighting my whole life, Marcus. Tomorrow's just another battle." The next morning, the courthouse loomed in the pale gray light of dawn, its imposing facade casting long shadows over the bustling crowd that had gathered on the steps. News of the trial had spread quickly overnight, whispers turning into a roar of speculation. The gallery was filled with spectators, journalists scribbling in notepads, community members eager to see justice, and Miller's fellow officers who lined the back row in a silent show of support for their comrade. Inside the courtroom, the hum of anticipation was almost unbearable. Victoria sat at the defense table, her expression calm but focused. Her navy blue blazer and neatly pressed white shirt gave her a commanding presence, one that seemed to silence the room even before the judge entered. Beside her, Marcus Davis flipped through his notes, his nerves betrayed by the subtle tapping of his pen against the table. "Are you ready for this?" he asked in a low voice, glancing at her. Victoria turned her head slightly, her gaze steady. "I've been ready for years, Marcus. Let's give them the truth." The gavel struck and Judge Thompson entered the room, her stern face surveying the crowd. "Court is now in session. We will continue with the case of State versus Victoria Hartley." The prosecutor, a seasoned man with sharp features and a suit that seemed tailored to intimidate, stood first. "Your Honor, we intend to reinforce the testimony of Officer Miller today and present additional evidence to support the charges against the defendant." Victoria didn't flinch, her hands resting lightly on the table. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but she remained as steady as a rock in the tide. The prosecutor called Miller to the stand again, his polished demeanor masking the growing tension in the room. Miller adjusted his tie as he walked to the stand, his movements slower than usual, as if weighed down by the scrutiny he could feel, pressing in from every angle. "Officer Miller," the prosecutor began, his voice firm but measured, "please remind the court of the events that led to the defendant's arrest." Miller cleared his throat, his voice carrying a hint of strain. "As I stated before, I encountered the defendant near a closed business. She was acting suspiciously, refused to identify herself, and became physically aggressive when I attempted to question her." "And you stand by your account of her behavior?" the prosecutor pressed. "I do," Miller replied, his eyes flicking toward Victoria for the briefest of moments. The prosecutor nodded, satisfied. "Thank you, Officer Miller. No further questions." Marcus rose slowly, his expression unreadable. He adjusted his tie and approached the stand with deliberate steps, each one echoing in the silent courtroom. "Officer Miller," Marcus began, his tone calm but carrying an edge that made Miller shift slightly in his seat. "You testified that my client became aggressive and attempted to reach for your weapon. Is that correct?" "That's correct," Miller replied, his voice steady but his posture rigid. "And yet," Marcus continued, "you stated that your body camera malfunctioned during the incident. Convenient, wouldn't you say?" Miller's jaw tightened. "It was an unfortunate coincidence. Equipment malfunctions happen." "Of course they do," Marcus said, nodding slightly. "But you've been on the force for what, 10 years? How often has your body camera malfunctioned during an arrest?" Miller hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "Not often, but it happened this time." Marcus pressed. "During an arrest where you claimed the defendant behaved so aggressively that you feared for your safety?" "Yes." "And you weren't acting like a Navy SEAL that night," Marcus shot back, his voice sharp. "You were acting like a bully who thought he could get away with abusing his authority. But you didn't count on her standing up to you, did you?" The room was deathly silent, the weight of Marcus's words pressing down on everyone present. Miller opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Marcus turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I have no further questions." Miller stepped down from the stand, his shoulders slumped as he returned to his seat. His fellow officers avoided his gaze, their earlier confidence in him now replaced with doubt. Victoria watched him for a moment before leaning toward Marcus. "The walls are starting to crumble." Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Let's finish the job." The courtroom was heavy with silence as Officer Daniel Miller returned to his seat. His confident facade had crumbled, and he now looked like a man walking the edge of a crumbling cliff. The air in the room was dense, charged with unspoken tension. The jury exchanged glances, their expressions betraying growing unease. Even the judge, typically stoic and detached, leaned forward slightly, as though sensing the tide turning in ways even he hadn't anticipated. At the defense table, Victoria sat unmoving, her composure a stark contrast to Miller's unraveling. Her calm presence had begun to feel almost imposing, a quiet strength that filled the room more effectively than any words could. Marcus Davis flipped through his notes one last time, his jaw tightening in determination. This wasn't just a case to him anymore. It was a reckoning. Judge Thompson cleared her throat, breaking the tense silence. "Mr. Davis, do you have additional evidence to present?" Marcus stood, buttoning his jacket before addressing the court. "Your Honor, the defense has one final piece of evidence to present, evidence that will leave no doubt as to what truly happened on the night of my client's arrest." The gallery buzzed with whispers, the spectators craning their necks to see what would come next. Miller shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the table. The prosecutor, Richard Avery, visibly tensed, his earlier confidence replaced with wary suspicion. Victoria remained still, her gaze steady as Marcus retrieved a file from his briefcase. He held it aloft for the jury to see. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady but firm. "What you've heard in this courtroom over the past few days is a tale of two stories. Officer Miller would have you believe that my client, a woman with no prior criminal record and a career dedicated to serving her country, suddenly became violent and aggressive for no reason. But the truth is far simpler and far more troubling." He opened the file and pulled out a series of documents. "This," he said, holding up the first page, "is Officer Miller's personnel record, and what it reveals is a pattern of behavior that speaks to his credibility, or rather, his lack of it." The prosecutor leapt to his feet. "Your Honor, I object. This is irrelevant to the case at hand." Judge Thompson raised a hand to silence him. "Overruled, Mr. Avery. You may continue, Mr. Davis." Marcus nodded and addressed the jury directly. "Over the course of his career, Officer Miller has been the subject of multiple complaints: excessive force, racial bias, improper conduct. These complaints were either ignored or buried by the department. But today, they come to light." He handed copies of the documents to the jury, who studied them intently. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, and even the judge's expression darkened as she scanned the pages in front of her. "Let me be clear," Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. "This is not just about one bad decision. This is about a pattern of abuse, a pattern that culminated in the false arrest and mistreatment of my client." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room before turning toward Victoria. and now it's time for her to speak her truth. Victoria rose slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She walked to the front of the courtroom, standing tall and commanding as she addressed the jury. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Victoria Hartley," she began, her voice clear and steady. "For 20 years, I served in the United States Navy as a SEAL. I've been to places most people can't imagine, faced dangers most people will never know, and through it all, I've held myself to the highest standards of integrity and discipline." Her eyes swept over the jury, each word carrying the weight of her experience. "I have faced enemies on the battlefield, but I never thought I would face one in my own country. That night, I wasn't a threat. I wasn't breaking any laws. I was simply existing, something that for people like me often feels like a crime in itself." The gallery was silent now, the earlier murmurs replaced by a palpable sense of shame and reflection. Victoria continued, her voice unwavering. "Officer Miller didn't see me as a person. He saw me as a target, a means to assert his power and control. But what he didn't see was my strength, my resolve, and my refusal to be silenced." She turned to face Miller directly, her gaze piercing. "You underestimated me, Officer Miller, but more importantly, you underestimated the truth, and the truth has a way of coming to light." Miller looked away, his face flushed with humiliation. The jury's eyes followed Victoria, their expressions a mixture of awe and anger, not at her, but at the system that had allowed this to happen. Victoria turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I fought for this country. I fought for justice, and I'm here today to fight not just for myself, but for every person who has ever been wronged by those sworn to protect them." The room erupted into applause, despite the judge's gavel striking repeatedly. "Order!" Judge Thompson barked, though even she couldn't hide the respect in her eyes as she looked at Victoria. Marcus stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Lieutenant Commander Hartley. No further questions." As Victoria returned to her seat, the energy in the courtroom shifted. The jury looked at her with newfound respect, their earlier skepticism replaced by conviction. Miller, on the other hand, seemed to shrink in his chair, his earlier bravado now a distant memory. Judge Thompson leaned forward, her voice heavy with finality. "We will now move to closing arguments, and I suggest both parties choose their words carefully." The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath, the tension thick, the silence heavy, as the prosecutor, Richard Avery, rose to deliver his closing argument. He adjusted his tie nervously and approached the jury, his usual confidence replaced with a strained composure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Avery began, his voice measured but lacking its earlier vigor, "what we've seen here today is a complex case. While the defense has worked hard to paint Officer Miller as a man with a questionable record, I urge you to consider the broader picture. Law enforcement officers make split-second decisions every day, often under difficult circumstances. Officer Miller believes he was acting in the best interest of public safety." He paused, his gaze flickering toward Miller, whose face was a pale mask of unease. "Mistakes may have been made," Avery admitted, "but that does not change the fact that Officer Miller was doing his job. The defense's claims, while compelling, do not erase the fact that the defendant questioned authority, resisted an officer, and escalated the situation." Avery's tone hardened as he finished. "I ask you to consider the facts and not be swayed by emotion or spectacle. Thank you." The courtroom remained silent as he returned to his seat. Marcus Davis rose next, his movements deliberate and calm. He adjusted his jacket, straightened his tie, and approached the jury with an air of quiet confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Marcus began, his voice steady and firm, "what we've seen here today is not a complex case. It is, in fact, painfully simple. My client, Lieutenant Commander Victoria Hartley, a decorated Navy SEAL and an American hero, was profiled, mistreated, and lied about by a man who abused his power. He turned, gesturing toward Victoria, who sat with her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the table. Victoria Hartley did not resist arrest. She did not threaten Officer Miller. What she did was ask a question, a simple, reasonable question. Why? And for that, she was thrown against a car, handcuffed, and humiliated. Marcus's voice rose, his passion filling the room. This isn't just about Victoria Hartley. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that those who wear a badge and swear an oath to protect and serve are held to the highest standards of integrity. Because when they fail to do so, the entire system fails. He took a step closer to the jury, lowering his voice for emphasis. Today, you have the power to send a message that no one, not even an officer of the law, is above accountability. That justice is not just a word we say, but a principle we uphold. I trust you to make the right decision. Marcus returned to his seat, and the courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Judge Thompson gave her instructions to the jury. Then they were dismissed to deliberate. The hours felt like days. Victoria sat in the courthouse hallway, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Marcus paced back and forth, his brow furrowed in thought. The low hum of conversation from nearby spectators and reporters filled the space, but Victoria tuned it all out. "Do you think they'll see the truth?" Marcus asked, breaking the silence. Victoria looked up at him, her expression calm but resolute. "They don't need to see it, Marcus. They need to feel it. The truth has a way of making itself known." Before either of them could say more, the bailiff appeared in the doorway. "The jury has reached a verdict." The courtroom was packed as everyone filed back in, the tension almost unbearable. Victoria stood beside Marcus at the defense table, her face an unreadable mask. Across the room, Miller sat stiffly, his eyes fixed on the jury box. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a serious expression, stood as the judge addressed her. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady. The judge nodded. "Please read the verdict." The foreperson unfolded a piece of paper and began. "In the case of State v. Victoria Hartley, we find the defendant not guilty on all charges." A wave of emotion rippled through the room. Gasps, murmurs, and even a few quiet cheers broke out before the judge's gavel brought order. Victoria exhaled softly, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, a smile breaking through his otherwise professional demeanor. The foreperson continued. "Furthermore, we the jury strongly recommend that an investigation into Officer Miller's conduct be pursued." The judge nodded gravely. "The court will take this recommendation under advisement. Officer Miller, I suggest you retain counsel. This matter is far from over." Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed, cameras flashing, and microphones thrust forward. But Victoria stood tall, her presence commanding as she addressed the crowd. "This isn't just my victory," she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "This is a victory for accountability, for justice, and for everyone who has ever been silenced by those in power. I didn't fight this battle alone, and I won't stop fighting for others." Marcus stood beside her, watching with a mixture of pride and admiration. The crowd erupted into applause as Victoria turned and walked away, leaving the cameras behind. Months later, Officer Miller was dismissed from the police force and faced criminal charges for perjury and misconduct. His fellow officers, once loyal to him, distanced themselves as the investigation uncovered more of his abuses. Victoria returned to her quiet life, but her name became a symbol of resilience and justice. She was invited to speak at events, her story inspiring others to stand up against injustice. Though she had left the battlefield years ago, Victoria Hartley knew that her fight wasn't over, and she was ready for whatever came next. Because for her, justice wasn't just an outcome. It was a way of life. And just like that, the truth prevailed. A courageous woman stood her ground, exposing lies and demanding justice in a system designed to silence her. This story isn't just about one victory. It's a reminder that standing up for what's right can change everything.